got one for the golf fans this morning. The start of Genesis 39 is like this moment here when Rory McIlroy won the 2025 Masters tournament. And you may be thinking, what on earth are you on about, Dave? So let me explain what is going on here. Rory McIlroy winning that tournament and so completing golf's Grand Slam, which if you're a non-golfer like me, let me explain, that is winning all four of golf's major tournaments, was something that Rory McIlroy had been promising to do for a very long time and yet had never quite got there. It was way back in 2011 that he won his first major, the US Open. He followed that up by winning his second major, the PGA Championship, the next year, 2012. Number 3 of 4 came in 2014 when he won the Open, a year in which he also ran the PGA Championship for the second time. And at this moment, his momentum was building. People thought it was just a matter of time before he won that remaining major, the Masters. Well, things looked like they were going in the right direction. 2015, he secured his best ever finish, a 4th place finish at the Masters. The next year, 2016, he was in contention right into the last round, but then he fell away from the lead. He said afterwards the pressure, potentially keep completing that Grand Slam, got to him. Then 2017, injury wrote off the season for him, and in the seasons after that, his sort of standards dipped a bit, at least according to his own high standards. 2022, he came so close, and yet he was so far as the runner-up. And then he had a couple more sort of wilderness years, and people started to wonder if this would ever happen for him, or whether this Grand Slam would elude him. Even in the tournament this year, he was on target to win and then had a bit of a wobble towards the end before winning it in a playoff. And then that moment happened when he realised it's finally happened. The promise is realised, it's finally happened. Now, you might not be a golf fan, so if that means nothing to you, think of your favourite TV show. Maybe there's a will they, won't they between two of the protagonists. Think of that moment they finally get together. It's finally happening. Or maybe your favourite performer, singer, band are coming to the UK. You've tried to get tickets on their previous tours. You haven't managed. You're in that Ticketmaster queue watching the thousands slowly dive down. But then you make it to the front. There's still tickets remaining. It's finally happening. You get to go. You get to see them. Genesis 39. Something else is finally happening. But it's more exciting than winning the Grand Slam in golf, or getting to see your favourite artist, or even that moment where they come together in the favourite TV show. In Genesis 39, the thing that is finally happening is that God's promises made to Abraham back in Genesis 12 are sort of starting to come true in a big way. Let me read them, and then we'll see if we can spot them in Genesis 39. God said to Abraham these words. He said, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Okay, with those ringing in our minds, come back to the start of Genesis 39 and see if you can pick up some of the echoes of Genesis 12. Let me read from verse 1. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of the Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who'd taken him there. And the Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favour in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household and entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food that he ate. Did you hear them? Those echoes ringing through. Joseph is blessed by having the Lord's presence in his life. And so he's a blessing to others, particularly to Potiphar and his household. And as Potiphar blesses Joseph with his trust, so God blesses Potiphar through Joseph. And remember, it made it really clear, didn't it, in the middle of verse 5, he's an Egyptian. The Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. That is to say, he's not one of God's chosen people. He's part of the nations, those beyond God's people. It's the start of all peoples on earth being blessed by Abraham's descendants. It's a finally happening moment. And as these promises start to bear out in life, what does Potiphar respond? What does he do? Well, he entrusts his all to Joseph. Did you notice the progression? At the start in verse 2, sort of Joseph he's in the house, but it sort of feels like he's down the bottom. And then verse 4, he becomes Potiphar's attendant. And then he's put in charge of everything he owns. And it's the end of verse 4 in the household, from in the house to being the attendant to being sort of the chief steward right at the top. And Potiphar finds that the more he entrusts to Joseph, the more blessed he becomes. It's a massive, positive, reinforcing cycle. And so he just gives more and more and more over to Joseph. And you may be thinking, well, that's all very well for Potiphar, but what about me? I don't have this guy living in my house. And when we're thinking that, we have some good news, because as we saw a couple of weeks ago, Joseph, he foreshadows someone who was to come. Let me explain what I mean by foreshadowing. You know how it works. If you were walking out the back of our house and you saw that shadow on the ground, you'd know that someone was coming around the corner. Someone was about to appear. In this case, it's my daughter Ayla just coming around the wall. And Joseph, he's like that shadow on the ground, showing that there is one to come. And that one to come is Jesus Christ, the one in whom God's promises to Abraham are ultimately fulfilled. And here's why that's good news for us, because just as Potiphar was blessed as he entrusted more and more and more of his life to Joseph, so we can be blessed as we entrust more and more and more and more and more of our lives to Jesus. Whether it's our daily needs or our eternal future, whether it's our work or our health, whether it's our relationships or our children, whether it's our joys or our sorrows, our anxieties or our security. The promise of Scripture is that as we entrust more and more of those things to Jesus, as we follow his ways in navigating those things, we'll get that sort of ever-growing spiral of enjoying and experiencing God's blessing. Now, don't mishear me, because that's not to say that our circumstances will always be cheerful. You heard the rest of the chapter read by Edward. You know that what's coming up. But have a look at the end of verse 6. Potiphar, he didn't concern himself with anything except what he ate. There's a sort of deep freedom that comes from entrusting ourselves to Jesus Christ. It's part of the blessing he longs to offer us. And that freedom cuts across all of life. Okay, that's the first thing we see in Genesis 39. That's sort of picture of Joseph blessing Potiphar as God's agent of blessing. The first building block in the story. The next building block of the story, we're going to see Joseph resisting temptation. Why? Because he wants to honour the God of blessing. Okay, second half of verse 6, we've got Potiphar's wife stepping in to the story. And she doesn't come off well, does she? So just to have in the back of your mind, remember the very obvious truth that Genesis 39 comes after Genesis 38. And if you were here last week, you'll know that Judah, one of Joseph's brothers, behaved dreadfully in his sexual mistreatment of Tamar. Here we've got Potiphar's wife's sexual temptation of Joseph. As I heard one pastor put it, neither men nor women have a monopoly on virtue or vice when it comes to sexual ethics. So please don't think I or the scriptures are particularly having a go at Potiphar's wife this morning. And yet she is the one in focus. So what happens in Genesis 39? Well, halfway through verse 6, Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. Potiphar's wife didn't take that refusal in her stride. So verse 10, she sort of persists, and she spoke to Joseph day after day, but even despite her doing that, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. And you sort of think, what is it that helps Joseph in this moment resist this temptation? If you do the math from the surrounding chapters, you can work out he's a young guy, he's 27, 28 at this point. He's good looking, he's single. And although he's in something of a position of prominence in Potiphar's house, he's still a slave. And he's living in a place where sort of sexual service was expected of slaves. And he's not the one looking for temptation. Temptation's come looking for him. In fact, temptation is chasing him down, pursuing him, not letting him get away. And so why does he resist? How does he resist? We'll come back to verse 8 again. He refused. Why? Let's see what he said. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in his house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" You see what Joseph says? He doesn't want to abuse the trust that Potiphar has given him for his own gain. He just honours that trust way too much to give in to temptation. But more than that, he knows that to do so would be a wicked thing. Strong language, isn't it? A wicked thing. And he doesn't want to sin against God in that way. He doesn't want to wrong the one who's trusted him. He doesn't want to wrong his God by sinning against him. Which, of course, is great news for Potiphar. And although she doesn't see it, actually, it's great news for Potiphar's wife as well. And because, once again, Joseph foreshadows Jesus, it's great news for all of us too. Because when you entrust your life to Jesus, you can be completely confident that he will not do wrong by you. Because actually he values your faith, your trust in him far too much to do that. But even more than that, he has no desire to do something that would be wicked in God's sight. He's entrusting your life to Jesus Christ is an entirely safe thing to do. And so if you're here this morning and although you wouldn't call yourself a Christian, maybe you're looking into Christian things. Maybe there's something about Jesus you find captivating, but you're just a bit nervous. And so you're keeping him at arm's length because you're not sure what would happen if you let him in. That somehow he might take advantage of you, that you might be some sort of pawn in his cosmic game of chess. Well, if that's you this morning, know from Joseph, the one who foreshadows Jesus, that he won't do that. Jesus, he resisted temptation for your sake while he was on earth. And as he sits at the right hand of the Father, so he does the same. It's an entirely safe thing to do, to entrust your life to Jesus. He will not abuse that trust in any way. Okay, back in Genesis 39, what have we seen? We've seen Joseph blessing Potiphar as an agent of God. We've seen Joseph resisting temptation to honour God, and then we're going to see Joseph suffering, silently trusting God. Verse 11. One day Joseph, went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants were inside. She, Potiphar's wife, caught him by the cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. And when he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." Joseph definitively doesn't do what Potiphar's wife wants him to do. And in that moment, the false accusations start to fly. They start with the household servants, but then they escalate and they go right to the top, to her husband, to the captain of Pharaoh's guards. Verse 16, she, Potiphar's wife, kept Joseph's cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story. "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." When his master heard the story his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me," he burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, in the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And as I was reading this and mulling this over in the week, there were two things that really surprised me about these verses. Here's the first one. Why does Potiphar let Joseph live? In the Egyptian court, attempted rape was a capital offence, and he's the captain of the guard. Potiphar certainly could have had Joseph killed for this if he'd wanted to. So why didn't he? And then if he does have, for some reason, for him to be lenient, why send him to the king's prison, the place where his prisoners are confined? I mean, sure, it's still a prison, but if you're going to be incarcerated, surely that's the one to go to, where the king's prisoners are. Why does Potiphar let Joseph live? Why did he let him get off so lightly. Well, here's what I think is going on as I was mulling this in the week. I don't know what you thought when you heard at the end of verse 19 that he, Potiphar, burned with anger. When I first read that, I jumped to thinking that anger must have been directed towards Joseph. How could he do such a thing? But then I began to wonder, because we're not told, it's ambiguous, aren't we? Maybe that anger was directed somewhere else. Maybe it was directed towards his wife. Let me show you why I thought that. Have a look at verse 17 as Potiphar's wife speaks to him. That Hebrew slave you brought us. He has made sport of me. It's almost sort of an accusation behind her words, aren't there? And it's interesting, it's not, verse 19, it's not her husband, it's his master. The relationship, it seems, frosty, and maybe it's not the first time that this has happened, and maybe this anger is sort of welling up because Potiphar knows he has to do something. He can't ignore what it is his wife is saying, but he also knows that actually he's done nothing wrong, and he also knows that this man who's brought him so much blessing is about to be removed from his house. He knows this man is innocent, and yet he is pressured to condemn him. That was the first thing I found surprising. Why does Potiphar let Joseph live? Here's the second surprising thing. Joseph is silent. Did you notice? He doesn't say anything from verse 9, when he says, I'm not going to sleep with you, to the end of the chapter. Not a single word. He's completely silent in the face of all these false accusations. And I know that I wouldn't be. And so I found myself asking why again. Why was he willing to silently suffer as an innocent man? And we're not told why, so I can't be sure. But here's what I found myself wondering. Maybe his experience of God being with him and a conviction that God will remain with him was what kept him going. Maybe he looked back on how his brothers had sold him into slavery and how God had worked through that suffering to bring him to this place where he's being a blessing to Potiphar and his household. And maybe because of that experience, he reasoned that God would have purposes in this latest round of innocent suffering. And of course, if you know how Joseph's story ends, you'll know that that proves to be the case, because it's in the king's prison that Joseph interprets the dream of the cupbearer. And it's because he interprets the dream of the cupbearer that he ends up interpreting Pharaoh's dream. And it's because he interprets Pharaoh's dream that he's put in place to manage the famine response. And it's because he's put in place to manage the famine response that, to put it in no uncertain terms, he becomes the saviour of the world. Which once again, I wonder, does that remind you of anyone someone who was silent in the face of false accusations, who appeared before someone who had the power of life and death, and that person knew the one before them was innocent, and yet was pressured into condemning him? Does it remind you of someone whose condemnation was used in God's hands to bring about the salvation of the world? Well, if that is reminding you of anyone, surely it reminds you of Jesus. But here's the really striking thing. I don't know if Joseph knew where this would end. In fact, I'm fairly sure he didn't. But Jesus knew what was to come. He knew the suffering that was to come. He knew the pain that it would mean for him. And yet, knowing all that, he still chose to silently suffer for you and for me. If you entrust yourself to Jesus, he's not going to let you go. He was willing to suffer as an innocent one for you. In him, God will surely give you all things. Here's the question Genesis 39 leaves us asking. Will you entrust yourself to Jesus Christ? Will you give your all to him? Will you allow him to receive your life? Will you entrust it to him? Will you experience that delight of giving more and more over to him and finding more and more blessing and freedom in doing that? Will you take that step of faith that believes it is safe to entrust everything to Jesus, that he's not going to take advantage of you? You know he's safe because he values your trust too much to dishonour it. He doesn't want to sin against his God by abusing your trust either. He's not going to do that. Will you let him silently suffer in your place as an innocent man, that he might be your saviour? Will you entrust your all to Jesus? Genesis 39 asks us. Well, let me give you just a moment to consider your own response to that question, and then I'll lead us in a prayer.